welcome to Hive Mind Community Podcast brought to you by TechSoup. Our podcast is a part of the digital activism program through which we provide the civil society with knowledge, tools, grants and networking opportunities so they can thrive. Welcome. Today's guest is Thomas Coombes, a global communication strategist who developed Hobo-based communications to help human rights and other progressive movements develop new narratives for social change. He has spent 15 years working in political communications for Amnesty International, Transparency International, and the European Commission. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Thomas.
Thanks, Joanna. Pleasure to be here.
We live in multi-layered, complicated, and complex times. The ambivalence and ambiguity of the world have never been so visible every day. Besides the growth, development, and societal changes for good, we also observe inequalities, human rights violations, and social problems arise. Today, we will deep dive into constructive and alternative ways of building narratives based on hope. How have communications of social movements, activists, and NGOs changed during the last 15 years, from your observations and experience?
Oh, thanks, Joanna. Great question. So, I think the short answer is not enough. A lot of this work for me started when I just had this sort of realization that a lot of the tools I was using in social change communication, like press releases, petitions, we published reports, big PDFs. They were paper tools designed before the internet existed that we were just uploading to the internet, essentially. I mean, we were working on computers, but we're still things that have been designed for paper. And as everyone knows now, we engage with information on a screen very differently than when it's written on paper. But we are just taking these paper things and putting them up on screens and expecting people to engage with them with the same depth and also empathy that they would before. This was really important because at Amnesty International, the things we were writing were the testimonies of people who had survived horrible human rights violations. And, the reason we were doing that work is that people would feel empathy and compassion. So I went straight into a tangent there, but the point being, I think a lot of our work actually is designed in a way that hasn't adapted to how the internet has changed, not just our societies, but how we as human beings consume information. And there's a very deep point underlying that, which is this idea called information deficit theory, that lots of fields are based on the idea that if you just inform people, they'll change. If people know cigarette smoking is bad for them, they'll stop smoking. If we know that climate change is happening, they'll stop polluting the world, and so on. But actually what we're realizing is, well, no, human behavior is far more sophisticated than that and driven by a lot of other factors. So it's not just enough to give people information. Again, before the internet, it made sense that someone has to actually document things like human rights violations and bring them to light. But now with the internet, it's not that we don't have access to information. It's about the choice we make about what we focus on and also what we choose to believe. And so the change that's starting to happen in a more positive sense is I think people are starting to realize that we can either, and this is to paraphrase the commentator Ezra Klein, we can activate people with fear or we can inspire them, but what we can't do is be boring.
Thank you for this, and also sharing the quotes that are always some inspiration that we can stick and continue thinking with. But back a bit about communication in general. Could you share what is the difference between strategic communication and operational communication in NGO, reflecting the contexts that you shared? And what is important in those two different types of communication for NGOs?
Yes, I think that's a really important distinction, the sort of communication that we do sort of organizationally or traditionally versus what's more strategic. So I think on a traditional level, we've always thought that our communication is trying to raise awareness. And what I would like to say is that we should think of strategic communication as actually changing awareness. And so what I mean there is this basic insight in brain science or around human behavior is that we as human beings learn behavior from what we see other people doing and thinking. So we can't act a certain way or think a certain way unless we've learned that from seeing someone else say it. And that's really important for social change. If we want the way we act or behave or think or live to change, someone has to put that new way of being out there in the world for us to copy. And so if social change communication is focused on showing only what's wrong with the world, how are we ever going to learn to do those new things? How is the change going to happen? So that's where the difference comes in is, of course, there's a role for making aware the things that are happening that we don't want to see, but that's just raising awareness. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, once my audience know the bad thing is happening, what do I want them to do next? And so at the very least, we have to balance that traditional communication with that strategic imperative to actually change society by showing how society could be. But actually, it may also prove that there is enough information out there about the problem, but what's missing is the alternative possibilities that could drive how we think, how we behave in that new direction.
Very well summarized, let's say. And thinking about the change and from knowledge to doing, I wanted to start with it that we live in polycrisis times and a lot of things are combined, and we have access to all of this horrific, but also on the other hand, very positive and mobilizing things all at once. And what are challenges that you observe in the landscape of NGOs, activists, humanitarians regarding the communications of works and causes that they are taking care of?
Yeah, you spoke about it in your introduction, actually, that, the complexity of the world. And, it's so much injustice that has been constructed, built into our societies that we all carry as well in the form of conscious or unconscious bias. But what I find gives me hope, actually, is when we talk about those complex constructs in society. We actually, just a partner of mine, Fotis Philippe, another hope-based expert, he said, gender is a construct. But then as soon as he said that, I realized, well, yes, all of the oppression and injustice in the world has been constructed by people. What that means is we can construct new, more just ways of living and structures and institutions. And so I think the challenge we face, actually, not just in terms of, rather than thinking in terms of threat or opportunity, there is an actual practical challenge for us. We have the tools as social change organizations to build new constructs, to nurture and grow more healthy ways of being. And so I think the challenge we all face is, again, something that comes from human nature. We all have a built-in negativity bias. The job of our brain is to keep us safe from harm. And so naturally, then our brain is going to err on the safe side. What is that thing? I don't know what it is. Let's assume it's harmful, right? That's how we stay alive. For building new constructs, for building a fairer society, that's complicated. And that brain of ours that's so focused, built around survival, isn't cut out to do that. And so what we all have to do is we can learn using tools like mindfulness. We can be aware when our brain is in that survival mode. We can take deep breaths and use all these other wonderful tools that are commonplace now in sort of, fields like self-care. I think our challenge is how we bring that into activism so that we think with our more calm, evolved brain in our work, in our activism, so that we can actually go about building these new things. And so just put that in more simple terms, right? There's so much horrible injustice. There's so much horror in the world every day that we can look at and see. The challenge is, how do we hold that and look at that while at the same time saying it does not have to be this way? There's another way this could be, and to start actually building that, to start carrying out that in our own actions so that other people start copying it and following it. So I think that's that sums up a little bit like the challenge where we are right now in making this shift towards being less fear-based and more hope-based.
Less fear-based and more hope-based. This is wonderfully said. And from that part, I think we can smoothly go from the fear direction to the hope direction. And I wanted to ask you the very broad and, let's say, philosophical question, because hope is a very important component of your work. Your methodology, your organization is built on hope, let's say. But I wanted to start from the general. What is hope to you?
Thanks so much. I'm so glad you asked that question. And because it's quite normal, a lot of people sometimes when they hear hope, they think positivity or optimistic. And so often I tend to tell people, I'm quite a pessimistic and negative and grumpy person myself. So the first starting point is, For me, hope means the belief that tomorrow can be better if we take action. It's goal-oriented thinking. There's a lovely novel that was released last year called Babel, which is like a science fiction, historical, fancy novel about colonialism. So all my favorite subjects put together. In there, they talk about hope being derived from a Latin word about speed. I think if I've gotten that right. But the point is it's about reaching faraway destinations. And so that's the really key point, what I want to get across to activism, right? I mean, I can totally relate if people dealing with really hard situations find it hard to grapple with the sense of hope. But to me, the darker the situation is, the more important hope is, because we have to believe that today's reality is not how it has to be. So it's, in a way, you could think of it like the things we think today are the actions we take tomorrow. You know, going back to that sense of how humans change. And so the purpose of hope is to actually show people an alternative, essentially. And then that's basically like our starting point with hope-based communication, that we feel if people have that perspective, you know, it leads to better sort of social outcomes. So when we talk about being hope-based, we're essentially taking that meaning of hope and making it a strategy. So the idea of being hope-based means you're basing your action, your strategy, your activism on the attitudes and behavior you want to see in future. So again, rather than reacting to the things in the world that you're against, you are thinking about how you want to see society be in future, how you want to see people behave in future, the kind of ideas and thinking that you think should be stronger in society, and you are already then basing your strategy on how do we make this happen. For example, it might be, okay, like I'm really afraid about the rise of authoritarianism and populism right now, but what I hope for is a world, say, where democracy is thriving and all sorts of different people with different backgrounds are involved in politics, for example. And so the strategy I implement to make that happen might be quite different to a strategy that's solely focused on, say, exposing the hypocrisy and corruption of populists. But it's quite funny. It sounds extremely simple, but just the process of making those little shifts tends to show people that, oh, there's all these strategies that I could be implementing to achieve my long-term goals that I'm actually just not using right now. So in that example, right, actually, the more I talk about the threat of authoritarian populism, I might actually be turning young people off from politics. Whereas my goal is that more diverse, engaging politics. Actually, I need to be investing so much more of my time in making politics fun and inspiring and like appealing that makes people get involved. Maybe one last thing I think that would really help understand it is there's a thing called hope theory from moral psychology, a guy called Schneider's hope scale it's called. But his basic idea is that hope in psychology is based on having a goal, seeing pathways to get to that goal, and then having a sense of agency that you're actually able to walk that path. And what I find really relevant for activism there is, he says, when people are high in hope, so when we're hopeful, to put it in simple terms, you're more likely to find alternative pathways to your goal. And that really resonates with me in a world of activism where, as we said right at the beginning, sometimes it feels like we're using the same tools over and over again, even if they're not working. So, you know, exposing corrupt politicians or populists for being hypocrites or whatever it is, and yet they still win votes. And I feel like the hope here, what we still have to test and what we hope we can achieve with this work, is that if we in social change become more hopeful, so we become better at identifying the change we want to see, maybe we'll find new strategies, new pathways to actually reaching that goal. As you can see, I have a lot to say about hope.
Yes, and this is very inspiring, and already noted down some recommendation of books. So thank you for that. I'm very glad that you shared that hopeful and hope is something different than positive, and that is more complex. And I think this is also resonates better with today's complexity as well, complexity of the world, to not share the vision of world that will be utopian, let's say. So thinking about this definitions from the foresight and speculative language, that this is more about protopian perspective, which is between and shows the pluses and the minuses. So I think the hope is really protopian thing, resonates well, I think, with me.
Johannes, one other thing you've just reminded me of, you know, that I was just saying earlier this morning to someone, that one way I like to say is that hope is actually radical. because a lot of what we think of as radical, for example, you might think of like very angry protests or say that are designed to get attention, to shock people, say like throwing paint on artworks. We think of those as radical, but they're not actually that new. You know, like if you look back in 1968, right, we've had angry protests throughout human history. Actually, what's radical is to say, I can imagine a world where we have a 3-day weekend, or we have complete gender equality, or people are able to move, or we have an economy in harmony with nature. And the thing is, to say those kind of hopes and dreams out loud involves a lot of vulnerability, because you sound more intelligent when you say we're doomed. And very, very rarely do people come back to you and say, oh, you said we're doomed, but we turned out okay. And so, but when you say, actually, I believe we could have a world where we don't have racism or sexism anymore, you're going to get attacked for it. So it's much harder to actually have a radical vision. Oh, not to mention, opponents of your measures saying, you lack credibility or you're naive. So it's actually much more radical to imagine a world where we've healed the harms that are being done than it is to just point out the harms.
Thank you for adding it. Also, when you shared about hope and slowly moving to the hope-based communications, I thought that before we start to communicate as social movements, we should try to do this, let's say, inner or mental exercise, and just rethinking and exercise from imagination. This is the wording that I like to use, that this is more about foresight or speculative perspective and alternatives that are not only right here, only at this moment, to react immediately. And this is a very constructive, long-term. Could you share more? What is hope-based communications in practice? For example, you shared 5 shifts connected to it. So please share your methodology with our listeners.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, in a way, as a good way to tee that up is the thing you were just saying about imagination. We like to share in workshops a quote from Rebecca Solnit, who wrote this book, Hope in the Dark. She said, violence is the power of the state, non-violence and imagination is the power of civil society. And so in the light of that quote, in a way, you see civil society's work is literally imagining how things could be, because we need to imagine things to make them possible, to be able to act on them. And so in practice, the work of hope-based communication is, actually, you summed it up really well. It's about people themselves using this method to actually remind themselves to do some imagination at the start of the process. But so the idea is that actually, rather than someone like me or another hope-based expert coming and telling people what their hope is, what to say, the point for us is, rather than finding a hopeful story, it's about everyone being able to find the hope in every story, or primarily in their story. Because again, if we want to change how societies work, if we want to change narratives, all of us actually need to be putting forward these ideas of how we want things to be in future. We need to be able to talk about our change. And as we've been discussing, it's so much easier to point out real problems and harms in this world because we can just point at them. But to look inwards and take an idea of how things could be and put them out, that's actually a lot harder. So I think that's why we have that sense of which you just said of reaction. And so what I like to say is fear is reaction, hope is action. And so essentially what we ask people to do is we can either have them apply to their daily work or go through the shifts and literally write down, here's my fear, what's the exact opposite of that? So what would be my hope? If we're documenting a problem, can we also document the solution? And actually, maybe do we need to dedicate more focus on showing people that our solution works? And then the third shift is inspired by the communications expert Anat Shenker-Osorio, who always likes to say you should talk about what you're for, not just what you're against. And this goes also then, the work we do within that shift is looking at our values, what do we stand for, but also just in terms of ideas. What's the way of thinking that we need to have more of in society? And there we get to things like caring, kindness, empathy, compassion, and how do we actually build those out more in the world? Then our fourth shift is threat to opportunity. So that's where we think very much of how are we trying to mobilize people, moving away actually from mobilizing more to organizing, which I think something we should talk about later. But essentially, rather than trying to make our audience feel guilty or shame, to give them a chance to be part of our movement and think of also what actions people can take that makes them share our values. What's really important there is the understanding that a lot of how people think For example, trends like confirmation bias, right, where just seeing facts doesn't necessarily change people's mind. A lot of our decision making is caught up in our identity, in a sense of belonging to a group. And so actually a lot of social change work is about creating that group belonging. And then our final shift is victim to human. So obviously part of that is just trying to counter those old habits, that things like poverty porn, which I think is hopefully out of our movements now, but we still have perhaps more subtle forms of that, like say good immigrant narratives when we talk about migration, or white savior narratives. And so that shift, we try and ask ourselves, who are the characters in our story? And essentially try and make sure we're not telling people's story for them, that people are protagonists in their own story. But then when we sort of, in one simple use of this is essentially for people to apply the shifts on their own to their work every day. And really, it's just about training a mindset then that people can use. But we also use those shifts to design new strategies. So once we go through all those shifts, we find we have like the basic structure of new narratives, new communication strategies that we can actually start trying to tell stories that shape attitudes and behavior long term.
Organization is taking those 5 shifts, rethinking their communication strategy, putting this framework with workshop with you or your team members, and starting some questions around, let's say, how can communication teams strike a balance between acknowledging harsh realities, the challenges, the problems that they are solving, and offering a hopeful perspective?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Maybe one small thing is like, one of the interesting things here is we find is hope-based communication actually isn't just for communicators. We find it actually works for everyone in every team. But it does, I think, show that communication, say with a small c, is really crucial to social change. So it does, I feel, shift communication to the heart of social change work. And also a really important thing of how we're trying to spread hope-based communication is it's not just the team at hope-based communication who do it. We do it's something we share under a Creative Commons license. So it's something anyone can use. We operate as a community rather than an agency, because we believe this is a tool that's really important for change, which we can talk about more. So in terms of that challenge, I think on a very basic level, the first step a communications team can do is to remind themselves that our goal is to change the thing we're seeing, not just to document it, but to replace it with an alternative. And so what you can start by doing at least is take the problem and put it in the context of the solution. So when people are suffering and there's nothing we can do about it, that's tragedy. But when people are suffering and it doesn't have to be that way, that's injustice. And so the point with communication is it's not enough to say, oh, this is a crisis, because sometimes people can say, oh, that's just how things are. Humans are cruel, the world is a hard place, and so the people are suffering. What we need to do is show we actually could heal these harms. We could fix this. Things could be otherwise. And that, I think, is what the difference is, again, between traditional communication or journalism and strategic social change communication, is making people believe that there's an alternative and actually, crucially, starting to act differently, starting to actually carry out that alternative. And so I think the first step is, so let's put the harm in the context of how things should be. And then actually, let's start see how can we actually simulate this behavior? How can we actually make people more likely to think or act in a way that's going to actually make lives better for the people we're working for? I think that's a really key thing. I think what I always try and come back to, I really totally understand anyone who kind of finds it hard to talk about hope in dark times. Really, all of this approach is how do we make life better for people who are, in the case of, from a human rights perspective, suffering human rights violations. And if you think you're doing everything right to help those people right now, then maybe you don't need this approach. And if you think about this approach and it doesn't work for you, that's totally fine. But that's why we build this around shifts. We just want you to ask yourself, have I actually made the case, for example, for a solution, for a new kind of policy that will help people affected by harms, by human rights violations? Am I actually doing everything I can to actually really push this new approach that will actually make people's lives better?
Thank you. So, yeah, a lot about changing the narrative and perspective inside the head, and then continue it depending on the situation, as the occasion of communications, operational one, just like the daily on with the audience or the stakeholders that are very important for some organization, but also inside. So I hear that this should be cohesive, coherent. That this should be the whole story of rethinking the way we see each component of social work. So it's not only about communication outside, but also how we build narrative inside of the organization. Because I believe this is very important, especially as there are many processes of restructuring, for example, communication strategies, or I don't know, going to some online courses on how to communicate online via place most popular social media platforms. But also what I hear from the things that you just shared is that it should be combined and it should be linked each other, and the hope should be inside and outside. You have to believe in it. You have to believe in the alternative to continue communicating it outside, especially that it's hard.
You know, you've really summed up why this approach, I think, is important for us, is the sort of challenge that we have wanted to react to designing this approach is we have populist authoritarians all over the world who are really good at leading the agenda and setting the debate with fear. And they will say something controversial or toxic, and they get rewarded for it with attention, because attention is the currency of this digital age. And so you can say, I like to say, the way I feel sometimes in a lot of countries is a politician can say something that would get them kicked out of a pub because it's so outrageous, but instead of being kicked out of the pub, they're put on the front page of the newspaper. So this is that challenge of we react to them, and then the whole conversation becomes around, oh, the far right are growing in Europe, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because there's no one else on the spectrum. For example, like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, he's just hung around 15 years saying outrageous things, and no other politician has sort of stayed on the scene that long. He's just sort of filled the space of our imagination of what politics is. And I think this is what other populists do as well. And it's a really simple formula at the base of narrative change, which is repetition. A lie repeated 3 times starts to feel true. And so we really have to just simply repeat and make familiar basic ideas for them to stick. And so from a social change perspective, that might be things like kindness, caring, compassion, empathy. We're all human beings. Communities are strong when we take care of each other. For you to articulate, anyone who's using hope-based communication, what are you actually for? And so the point is to achieve that constant repetition. I feel the only way for it to be something that all of us repeat every day is for it to actually be truth, as in the actual values that drive us. And I think what happens in a lot of social change work is we either don't think about, or we just bury deep down inside us the reasons we do this work. And so we don't talk about it because we think you're not meant to talk about love and care and kindness because that's not political realism, that's not common sense, it's not utilitarian. And so our values are never getting talked about. And so what we're actually essentially trying to do is sort of excavate within themselves their own why, and so that they actually then start repeating it all the time. Just take, for example, migration. A lot of the times we'll hear people say, oh, we should welcome migrants because it's good for the economy. But I can guarantee you, I don't think there's anyone working in migrant rights and human rights who does it because they think migration is good for the economy. They do it because we're all human beings, and no matter who we are or where we come from, we should be welcomed and we should have welcome opening societies. But we don't often say that. And so, yeah, sorry, I just wanted to, I thought that was so important what you said, is like for this to be sustainable, it actually has to be our own values.
Thank you. And I note down filling the space of imagination, that this is very important, very important to keep in mind, that social movements are doing tremendous work, and all the activists and NGOs around the world. And it's really about remembering to fill the space of imagination that we want to build, not that to just like react and be okay. This is the imagination that is mainstream, fear, clickbaits, a lot of controversy, that this is possible to propose alternative that will be really attractive, constructive, and recreates everything differently.
That sounds like we've got our podcast title there.
Oh, yes. This is great. This is great. About hope. getting back. How do we measure or check the level of hope in communications? Do you have any recommendations how to do the check-ins when we have it like, okay, we have those 5 shifts, we believe in it as an organization, also, for example, as social movement, and we are trying to fill in more and more space of imagination of our community and other stakeholders that are against us. But let's say 2 years after this shift, and how to check this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's something I feel like we need to do a lot more work on. The first step for me is to ask ourselves, is this what I actually hope for? Just literally just to ask myself. And this again goes back to this idea of being hope-based, which is not necessarily about it being hopeful necessarily, but it sort of take that aspect of hope out of it and just say, am I actually literally making the case for the thing I want in society? Or am I just trying to make what I think is the most politically expedient argument right now? Right. So, for example, I want to live in a caring, welcoming, open society with diversity. Have I actually made the case for that? Or have I just said, migration is good for the economy? So essentially, to put it this way, using that example, am I making the case for migration or am I making excuses for migration? But the point being then, I just feel like, again, even if you can't take all this hopey, changey stuff, just ask yourself, am I actually making a strong case for what I believe in? Because again, it's like a muscle. If I'm not exercising and putting out there those values and beliefs, they're not getting used and they're not becoming strong in society. And so that is, I think, a basic measurement we can look at is essentially the salience of narratives. So like what sort of percentage of a public conversation is representing in my narrative. So on really simple terms, you could take migration, for example, and see, right, so we did a social listening analysis a few years ago. We found 50% of the conversation on migration is negative, like migration is a problem. 40% was neutral, so there's a massive crisis. And only 10% was actually saying migration is a good thing. So you might have a goal of, in 2 years' time, I want there to be more of a positive conversation. Or you could be more sophisticated and say, when people, for example, are talking about civil society, what are they saying about it? And so right now, for example, that conversation using those words tends to be about threats, or civil society's space is shrinking or threatened. That means the only narrative is this thing is failing, which isn't actually very appealing for people to join. And what's missing from the conversation is civil society is actually about community. It's about people who come together to make their societies better by working together, for example. So that basic thing, I think our starting point is that the salience of the ideas we want to get out there in society. A really hard question I've been getting a lot lately is like, how soon can we do this, right? We're trying to win this election. Do we have time to actually make politics kinder and more loving? And there it feels a little bit, unfortunately, I have to use a metaphor from running training, from sports training. We have, when we're running or doing other kind of sports, we have slow twitch and fast twitch muscles. So essentially, you can imagine someone sprinting or someone jogging. And the muscles that you develop in both those activities are actually both relevant for each other. And so building a little bit of that long-term underlying way of thinking will still help you in a short-term election. And the story that we choose to tell of today's election will influence that long-term thinking as well. So they both work together.
All right. So it's about long-term thinking and not focusing on the short-term and the crises that are upon us, because what's the other way? I mean, that we tried many times with this sprinter mode. So I guess what has left for us. So I guess this would be a good shift.
Yeah, what's really important to always repeat, obviously, is that we still are taking those crises very seriously. The point is, what's the story we're telling about them? Because the danger with constantly telling a story of crisis is that it starts to feel natural and that's just how things are. Or just creates fear in people, which is not the emotion we need to actually resolve them. So it's about that story we're telling. And I think also, though, part of applying those shifts, as I discussed earlier, it's also the challenge to then the person using the shifts to decide what success looks like. Because it's not just about engagement or media hits, because it's not enough for us to raise awareness, right? We have to change awareness and change behavior. And so we also need to know if people read this news story, well, first of all, will they read it? Will it get to them, in their TikTok feeds? But also, does reading that story change their behavior? And so, there's also a lot of qualitative work we need to do. Part of it just has to accept a certain amount of doubt and uncertainty, but, we can also do work of saying, okay, when people see a certain kind of story, is it having the desired impact? And so we can also actually ask ourselves, okay, we need more stories, say, of welcoming communities in a debate. But I think it also involves constantly testing and refining what is the impact of the things we're doing in the world. And, above all, I think it requires listening to people. And I think what's really important there is if we're angry, if we're shouting, it's a lot harder to hear.
Very nice said. And about the success and way that we can communicate things, could you share some examples of successful hope-based communication campaigns, or maybe generally speaking communication of some social movements and their impact?
The first thing that comes to mind is I was talking about salience, and so people who are successfully using that imagination, like we're talking about, and introducing new ideas with that more long-term change. I think the work of Puentes in Latin America is really important to single out. This is an organization, really quite new organization, run by the women's rights activist and lawyer called Monica Roa. And she's building an amazing organization. So Puentes means bridges in Spanish. And they have started to just build new channels to just bring to life new ways of talking about sensitive topics. So there's been this big wave of what's called gender ideology narratives. So essentially, populists saying, activists are undermining family values with LGBT and women's rights. And so rather than engaging with those, they found out who's actually putting out there content that uses a more, say, liberal or opening or human rights friendly way of talking about these issues. And so essentially they work together with influencers and content creators to put out stories, quote graphic, but very simple, engaging graphics on platforms people are using, very visual content. It might be stories like WhatsApp stickers. And one of the platforms is called Familias Ahora, so Families Now. And another is called Creo, which is like belief or I believe. So essentially just a new way of thinking about the family, so you can imagine, say, a cisgender male in a nurturing parent role, for example, but without sort of being preachy, but actually just thinking, here's a conversation we want to have. Here's the kind of imagery. Here are the kinds of words. And this is the kind of thing that like we said right at the start, right? All of these complex things around us in society are constructs. Sometimes they're very complicated constructs, but that means we need to make the new construct the way we want it to be. And so I think that's what's really important with Puentes is they're empowering ordinary people to do that. And I think what's very exciting for communications right now is we live in an era where, thanks to this new technology, which obviously has many risks, people make culture actually rather than institutions. We don't rely anymore on the small elite who run film studios and news organizations, or even big social change organizations, to decide what the conversation is and what words we use. We have this potential where all people, particularly people from disadvantaged backgrounds, marginalized communities, can shape these conversations. And I think that's what Puentes are doing. Like they call it building narrative power. And to me, that's really the future, both of narrative work, but also social change work in general. And in a similar example, since you're based in Poland, there's a wonderful campaign in Poland called, I hope I get the Polish right here, To Działa, which means it works. To działa, yeah.
To działa, yes.
And so what I found why that's a great example to me of narrative work is, as all over the world, civil society groups are facing the same set of narrative challenges, things like foreign agent laws that are really, really hard to counter. And what we try and do with a hope-based approach is to say, okay, these are harmful ideas that once they get into people's mind, they really stick. And if we just say, it's not true that we're foreign agents, we're reinforcing that idea. And so what we have to ask ourselves is, what is it I want people to think about civil society instead of this negative, harmful idea? And that's, again, why I think this hope-based approach is relevant in the era we live in, because someone has to come up with a new idea and bring it out there. And what To Działa do is they just tell stories, very visual human stories of communities, people in communities improving lives. Like my favorite video, for example, is there's like a very hipster guy who builds a sort of cycle rickshaw that he used to drive elderly people around the community. But essentially, it's putting a new image, making a new image available for the brain of our audience. And so to me, that is also one of the ways to measure success in this work. Coming back to our imagination is successfully offering people a new way to imagine or think about the ideas that we're talking about.
Thank you for these two very inspiring examples from two other parts of the world, actually, because this is also important that building narratives that are inspiring are all over. And also I wanted to, sticking to the examples, I wanted to ask you about the especially crisis moment of the topic that organization is taking care of, and would it need any extra action or a kind of different approach in terms of coping, meaning that how to communicate hope during especially dramatic and difficult situations such as wars, genocides, and this very like the end of the scale of the cruelty of humankind as well.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question. The hope-based communication approach was born in precisely these situations. Because I worked at Amnesty International and I'm a descendant from genocide survivors myself. So everything we do in this work is related to how we do that. And so the starting point is, what are the emotions that drive empathy and compassion, but in general, pro-social behavior, as in how do we make people treat each other better, put it in really simple terms. And moments of fear are the times when we're most likely to treat each other badly. So, our first start is understanding really what, and obviously that's a huge topic, but that's the danger of those moments of crisis, is that's when we're most likely to do harm to others because we feel protecting our in-group. So I think this is about this process of in-group and out-group formation. And so on that very basic level, just the fact that if people feel in control, feel hopeful in terms of they control the direction of society, right, that things aren't out of their hands, that's already a really important sort of inoculation or defense against the people who are going to come along and say, you're feeling afraid because of that other group, and they're to blame for how you feel, right? So that's, I think, on one of our basic level, and that's why, again, we have to be very careful when we ourselves use fear-based communication, because we may actually inadvertently be making things worse. But then there's also on a more sophisticated level, I think, again, I would invite people to just apply the shifts themselves and think, what is the outcome? What's the light at the end of this dark tunnel? So in any situation where we have conflict or two groups fighting each other, to me, the only sort of way out of that comes back to humanity, that people have to recognize each other's humanity. We need accountability, we need healing, we need peace and reconciliation. And so the strategy then would be built on how you actually bring that about. So, for example, if we see the situation where we have apartheid and genocide, well, when we look at what happened in another country that overcame apartheid, and the opposite of that we're trying to achieve is togetherness. And so what are strategies we can use to build that? And there is a lot of science around what drives empathy and compassion that we can use to draw on it. So, for example, one strategy we've designed that we haven't had a chance to sort of test out in the field yet is in a situation where sort of a pre-genocidal situation where, say, one group is spreading dehumanizing material, content, stories, language about the other group. How do we counteract that? Right? We all know that kind of thing. I'm thinking specifically here of Buddhist monks in Myanmar, when they spread this dehumanizing language about the Rohingya Muslim population. Just saying this is happening isn't stopping those hateful words getting into the minds of the target audience. And we can't, unfortunately, just extract it from those minds. So what we have to do is give people a new way of thinking. We have to bring those groups together. In fact, just the idea of reinforcing the idea that you have two different groups, in that case, Buddhist, Muslim, and those are the most important identities, and those groups are against each other. What we need to do is build a different narrative. So what we call it is rehumanization. When we're faced with, the terrifying power of the internet to spread this dehumanizing content at such a really scary level of sophistication, you're constantly refining hundreds of variations of videos and images of stories, that make us afraid of people who are different from us. We have to find ways to create empathy, compassion, curiosity, understanding between those groups, and healing, and find what's the story I need to show the person being targeted with this dehumanizing rhetoric, a story that will actually bring them back together to that group, and not just avoid them harming, which obviously is the main goal, but actually make them live together, peacefully together. So in a way, actually, and we're going to go to very simple terms, it's about strategy promoting love between human beings. And that's me being vulnerable, because it sounds very naive to say it, but that's what the work is actually about. It's about human rights work is about making people care about other human beings.
And the last question that I would like to ask you, that links perfectly with all the things that you shared today with me, but also with us, with all the people that played this episode somewhere in the world. How do you envision the field of hope-based communications evolving in the coming years?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. That's really lovely. And thanks to anyone who's listened this far. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we should evolve. But I've been really privileged, and so it's just very humbled that I've been this approach has been able to help people. Particularly, for me, I see it originally as a communications person, as a way to design strategy. But just when we do these workshops, people often what's really inspiring is seeing people have that aha moment themselves and just see things differently from their own perspective. And so until now, we've been operating as a sort of loose community of freelancers. And this year, we've decided to try and build an actual NGO around hope-based communication. I'm still deciding whether to call it the Center for Hope-Based Communication or maybe the Hope-Based Collective. But so the basic goal would be just to spread the approach, to provide more tools. So basically, we believe anyone can be a hope-based practitioner or expert. And we just want to make these tools more easily available. But we also want to go one step further and build a sort of community of people who are going to work together to actually bring these new hopes we have to life, and also to basically change narratives ourselves. So we want to do what we think of as collective storytelling. And I think that speaks to what we've been talking about with the cultural context, right? That in today's world, I think you can't sort of wield what Monica Rowe calls narrative power. We can't change ideas unless your stories can become visual stories. And crucially, you have to be able to organize people to tell those stories for you. So unless your message, your narrative is something that an ordinary person can act out on TikTok, on YouTube, on Instagram, it's not going to spread. You can't rely on words and press releases anymore or reports. Our world has become visual, but not just visual, it's to think in terms of sort of rituals, actions that we do every day. For example, Amnesty International was originally grown around people writing letters to political prisoners all over the world. So it has to be something we can see, but also crucially something we do, because belonging reinforces our support for political causes, and action reinforces that belonging. So what we really want to start doing is actually what we have already with hope-based communication is a tool for activists to find the hope in their story, to actually imagine these alternative possibilities. What we've realized is our next step is to create a sort of space, maybe you could call it a greenhouse, where people can grow or turn these hopes, these imagination to actual action, into actual things people do. And then a really crucial thing, I think, for me is that we have our sort of our movement. I'm trying to think of a word that's not army, a non-military metaphor, but essentially we need our army. I'm still working on that. If any listeners have ideas, please send them to me. But essentially our army of human storytellers, because as all communicators know, it's not enough just to post something on social media or just to get a piece of media coverage. What matters then is we all engage with the story, we all share it, we bring it to life through our own actions, we mimic it, like a piece of music or a particular sort of meme on TikTok. No one can tell the story on their own anymore. We have to all do it together. And so we don't know exactly how we're going to do it, I think, but it's clear to us the most important thing actually for us to focus on moving forward is actually just building that community of people who are trying to figure out how to hope and how to spread that hope. And so, again, if anyone's listening and is interested, our goal is to be open to everyone, because essentially we believe we can only bring about this change through people and by doing it together.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. And what can I say? I can say that I'm finishing this conversation with hope-based approach. Thank you so much, Thomas, for being here, for sharing all your thoughts and metaphors. It was a pleasure and it was wonderful.
Thanks, Joanna. So lovely to talk to you.
Looking for more resources in topics like countering disinformation, cybersecurity, personal and organizational resiliency, building positive narratives, or media literacy? Visit the HiveMind platform, an online hub with free content, tools, online courses, and ability to connect with digital activists across the globe. Embrace the power of community with HiveMind.